And so, Your Excellencies, without much ado now, please shall we all rise for the national anthem. Let's be seated, please. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome all of us to the closing part of this two-day summit. The last 2 days have been very, very insightful. There have been issues raised around developing the Nigeria we all desire. And we've had about 4 plenary sessions besides the breakout sessions. And all of these are adding up to developing Nigeria along the national development plans so that we can have prosperity that is shareable. So let me welcome all of you, but let me very quickly welcome some of our distinguished guests that are here. I'd like to welcome a man that is our own, but is a global commodity. United Nations, globally, everywhere relevant, but he also loves to serve his people. The Chief of Staff to the President, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, is here with us. Your Excellency, we welcome you. I'd like to welcome here the Honorable Minister of State for Budget and National Planning. Please welcome Prince Clem Agba. I welcome you, sir. The chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, the hardworking, probably after today, some of us will use handkerchief to clean our eyes that we are going to be missing you. Mr. Asue Ighodalo, I welcome you. Thank you very much. One of the founding fathers is here and is still relevant. And we pray that we will continue to hear your voice and see your face in years to come. Mr. Pascal Dozier, I welcome you. I was telling the managing director of MTN, and I think it actually is relevant to you, that your payoff line of everywhere you go, and everywhere I go, I carry your message with me that is fine to serve Nigeria. Thank you very much for what you have done. We appreciate you. But let me also appreciate all the captains of industry that are here. Professor Sarah Alade, ex-CBN, now serving Nigeria in different capacity. I welcome you too, ma'am. I welcome you. So without much ado, let me welcome all of you. Let me welcome all the members of the board of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. If you see anybody with the red lanyard, they are members of the board, distinguished people. Let's put our hands together for them, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. So without much ado, let me quickly go into the final and closing plenary. And the focus here will be on implementing the Nigerian project. We've looked at the Nigeria that we want. We've looked at the sub-national government and what we can do with them. We've looked at developing the future, and we also looked at leadership that is responsive, responsible, and resilient. Now, how do we begin to implement the Nigerian project? Our moderator will be the CEO, Alpha African Advisory, Ms. Sonyade Okoli. I don't know if this is deliberate on behalf of the NESG. Apart from Joe Abba, all the moderators we've had in the last 2 days are women. So these are the members of the panel representing the Secretary to the Government of the Federation. Is a Special Advisor to the President on Policy and Coordination, Dr. Habiba M. Lawal. To also join us here is the Chair, Central Working Group on the National Development Plan, Professor Sarah Alade. Let me welcome here Chairman, Nigeria Economic Summit Group, Mr. Asue Ighodalo. And then finally, the Managing Director, Shell Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria Limited, Mr. Osagie Okunbor. CEO, Indicina, Ms. Yvonne Johnson.
Priorities for shared prosperity. Nigeria is at a point in history where the need to re-examine the nation's foundational principles and priorities is paramount. What are the challenges to execution, and how can we rally and implement the various strategies and development plans that articulate ways to attain the Nigeria of our dreams? A Nigeria worthy of being bequeathed to the next generation. Plenary 5, implementing the Nigerian project. This plenary is interpreted for our virtual audience in Pidgin, Hausa, Igbo, French, and Yoruba. Follow the on-screen instructions to gain access. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome our panelists for this plenary.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this last plenary. We too shall stand on the existing protocol, and we will first of all thank all of you for coming here. We know it's been a busy day and a half, and we stand between the final speech and the end of the session. So thank you for making the time. And also thank you to our panelists for having made the time to come here. As the video said, this is about implementing the Nigeria project. I don't need to take time to tell you where we are as a nation. We are all living it and we're feeling it. But in reality, we talk about the problems everywhere, and we also talk about the solutions, great solutions from beer parlors to boardrooms to NESG for 27 years. But we are still where we are, which begs the question, why? What's happening with implementation that's resulting in us not being where we want to be as a nation? So that's what this esteemed panel are going to help us just flesh out over the next hour and a bit. So to start with, I was in the one of the panel sessions yesterday. We're talking about unblocking, the barriers, and Dr. Omoigui Okaru made a point. She said that part of our challenge is we always make assumptions. We think we're all on the same page, but we're actually not on the same page. We don't have a shared understanding of some of the things we're trying to achieve. So just to kick off, we're talking about implementing the Nigerian project. But what is that Nigerian project? So I'm going to start with Dr. Lawal and then also Dr. Alade. Just to your minds, what is that Nigerian project? So at least we can start with that shared understanding.
Thank you. The Chief of Staff, Mr. President, all other dignitaries and respective protocols observed. And to my mind, the Nigerian project is a prosperous Nigeria where each and every Nigerian feels that he belongs to and contributes optimally to creating that prosperous Nigeria. It is a Nigeria where there is security for all citizens. It is a Nigeria where the economy is stabilized. The Nigerian dream, it is a Nigeria where we have improved agriculture, we have food security within our nation. For me, Nigeria we want is one where there is improved health, education, there's inclusiveness in growth, and also there is sustainable growth between the different levels or the different tiers of government, not only at the federal, but at all the other levels. It is a Nigeria which we have sufficient drive for industrialization, improvement in small and medium-scale enterprises that will fire the economy. My idea of Nigeria, it will be that Nigeria in which there is no corruption and there is good governance. So to me, those are the kind of expectation. It is a Nigeria where the government, the private sector, and the citizens work together to improve the quality of governance and deliver service to Nigeria. So the Nigerians, wherever they are proud to be citizens of this nation. And working together, we can have a prosperous Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Alade?
Thank you. Chief of Staff, and then I'll stand on all existing protocols. Thank you. I just want to add, it's the Nigerian project, as she said, is what we want, the Nigeria we want. But I want to look at it from, slightly different side. That this project is a project where we make efforts to create what we want. Is where we have the courage to make policies today that is going to affect targets that we have set for the next 10, 20 years. We must work for it. We must be able to have the courage to, respond, to create a citizen that will be able to respond to opportunities and then be able to adjust to challenges, solve some of the issues that we want. So it's not just what we want, it's also what we are willing to work for, to create. So if we make policies today, we know that it might be difficult, but we want policies that should be able to help us achieve targets that we think in the next 10, 20 years, we will then have that kind of Nigeria that we are hoping for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I'm hearing is the whole concept of a Nigeria that works for all. But sometimes I just feel it's quite a sort of high-level, vague, non-specific term. So I'm going to ask Mr. Ighodalo, then I'll come back to you, Mr. Okunbor, but Mrs. Johnson. Just let's give a bit more flesh to this Nigeria that works for all.
Thank you, Sayade, Chief of Staff, Honorable Minister. You remember yesterday, I don't know if we all heard the Vice President saying he was looking forward to being on that side, and so that he doesn't get insulted all the time. And Sayade, in answering your question, it's difficult not to appear as if you are throwing darts. And I don't want to appear as if I'm throwing darts, because I want us to agree that we are in a place today, and the important thing is to move out of that place and move Nigeria into prosperity. And it's a very difficult question. There are too many things that need to be in place at the same time. One of probably the most important thing for me, as far as I am concerned, is the leadership to carry us through. We require leadership that understands where we are today, the problems we have as a country, and the willingness, the courage, like Dr. Alade said, and the strength to carry us out of those problems. The problems we have in Nigeria today, or the issues, and I don't want to call them problems, let me call them challenges and issues. Those issues require humongous courage to deal with. We heard what some of our panelists were saying yesterday, Mr. Obokun, Mr. Peterside. They require humongous courage. So we require a leader that has the determination and the will and the love of the people of Nigeria. That leader also must understand how to solve each of the problems that are important to us. Today, probably the most important problem that we must solve is the issue of security. You know, if we don't solve the issue of security, there's no way we can create prosperity in this country. And you know, I have said this, you know, in quiet circumstances, and I'll try and be brave to say it publicly. You know, if we don't understand the mechanics for solving the problem by ourselves, let's get help. You know, there's no problem we have that hasn't been solved somewhere before. So let's be humble enough to look for where to get help to solve the problems. Then we have the macroeconomic issues, and we've been nailing and caning those issues forever. And again, sometimes, you know, I've never been in government before, and I understand that there must be tremendous pressures on those who are in government, but I don't understand how we don't have the will, if we're interested in a better Nigeria, not to do certain things. And we've talked about them ad infinitum. We've talked about the issue of the fuel subsidy. I don't understand it, but those who are in government know why and how they can't do it, or they haven't done it. I don't understand why we have multiple exchange rates. I can understand that we need to think through how to deal with our own monetary management or foreign exchange management issues, because we have to look at the supply side, we have to look at the demand side, and we have to look at how to do all the balancing, you know, but we don't see thought and we don't see transparency, and I don't understand why we don't, you know, so these are the issues. I don't understand why when we spend on infrastructure, we don't see value for money. You know, so I think what we need is that strong transformational leadership and being able to call people to account. So if I give anybody in my office a task and they don't perform the task, I ask why, and if they're not fit for purpose, I remove them. Or I sanction them. And I don't see any of that. You know, we see people not doing what they're supposed to do, and no sanction, no consequences, and we continue along those lines. And if we continue like that, we will have even worse situation than what we have now. So for me, leadership, the will to want to do the right things, and the courage to start doing the right things. I don't think it's rocket science. I don't think Nigeria is difficult to govern. I think it's the will.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you a bit later with some of the points that you raised. Mrs. Johnson, let's hear your perspective.
Thank you, and also standing on existing protocols, Honorable Minister and Chief of Staff. I think there's three parts to my answer when I think about your question about, you know, what does that vision look like? You know, painting the picture of what the Nigeria for all is. And the first part is what we've always talked about. I think the idea of shared prosperity, and you know, it's part of the theme of the event. It's something that, you know, everybody can, you know, understand. Just the idea of shared prosperity. I think, you know, the economists would call it, you know, inclusive growth, right? You know, and there are very different ways of measuring that, right? You know, I think if you think about Nigeria, very key KPI or metric is just saying, you know, reducing the proportion of, you know, those in poverty, right? You know, so the idea of kind of shared prosperity, again, painting this picture of what is this Nigeria for all. You know, the second part of my answer is, you know, there is something about reducing the incentives for an average Nigerian to be insular. Because, and we hear about it all the time, you know, it seeps out in our speech where the incentives are for us to really just be insular, think about us and ourselves, right? And you really can't have this idea of kind of shared prosperity, certainly the concept of, a nation and a union, if everybody is really being insular, right? And so when I think about a Nigeria for all, it's a Nigeria where, all of us are not just thinking about ourselves, and we're not just incentivized to be insular, all right? And I think the third part of it, and this is one that is, kind of personal to me as well, and again, it's part of the discussions we're going to have, is a Nigeria that executes. Because when you think about it, and we had a lot of rich debates yesterday, a lot of good discussions today, privately and publicly in the panels, and a lot of things to hear is that it's not really about the ideas, right? Because there's tons of ideas, right? We know what the ideas are, what we need to do, whether it's security, removing the subsidies, this, that, and the other. We had very interesting panel on education earlier. But the one thing for me is to say that it's a Nigeria that also executes, right? It's because it's in the execution that you get this desired output. So if I was to paint the picture, those are the three parts that I will discuss.
Yeah, thank you. I particularly want to pull on the point you made about a Nigeria where we're not all thinking about ourselves, because I think that for me is a key issue. And I think in my day-to-day life, where I see it the most, and you see the consequences of that, is just go to any crossroads, any big junction, anywhere, in any of the busy cities, and you see the chaos that is created because we're all trying to, get one of, just meet our own needs. So thank you for that. I'm going to come to you again, Dr. Alade. If Mrs. Johnson has spoken about execution, and we know that there's a new, at the end of 2021, the National Development Plan. And the point of that is about execution, that you learned from the experiences of previous plans, Vision 2020, the ERGP, and even in how you've come to develop that plan, implementation has been one of the key drivers. Can you just talk to us a bit more about the plan and how you see it being implemented?
Thank you. The 2021-2025 medium-term plan, which we call National Development Plan 1, is for the nation. We have moved away from giving the impression that it's just a federal government plan. Well, it's national in the sense that it's both federal, states, and local government as well. And it had 4 strategic objectives, which I'll mention. One is that we want a diversified economy, create a diversified economy. To some extent, the economy is diversified, but we're thinking of even, diversification within sectors, so that we are not just where we started from. So that increases diversification. And then we also have the objective of infrastructure, investing massively in infrastructure, be it technological, the roads, transport, innovation, all sorts of infrastructure. We know that we have infrastructure deficit, and when you look at it, it's not just in terms of power, but in terms of almost everything that we need to make the economy develop. So that's another objective. The other third one is security and governance. We have, Asue has talked about security as one of the most important things that we have to create. So one objective of the NDP is, the security and governance, improve security in the country, as well as governance of the economy. And finally, we were talking about an educated and a healthy population. So when you look at it in that sense, we sort of touch the important things in the economy. So that's the objective. You also have some cross-cutting issues, like all the other things like the the tech, and so on that will enable us achieve that. The NDP, in terms of finance, we're looking at some 348 trillion naira, and 85% of that is to be financed by the private sector, while the other 14% will come from the public sector including the states, as I said, federal government, and the local government. So those are the highlights. And I'll just go on before I stop to talk about some of the critical success factors, why we think what we actually need to ensure that this development plan is implemented. The very first thing we need is plan continuity. You don't want a plan, we don't want policies that stops and go. With each change in administration, then you have either the development plan being jettisoned, abandoned, or some of the policies we do. So if we have this continuity, then you can be sure it will be. That means when you come, when a new government comes, it then takes over from. That doesn't mean that everything, there's always time for, to review what you have, but you don't want a wholesale, you don't want abandonment of what we have. And I think the government tried as much as possible to make sure that you have people from all walks of life work on the development plan. So that's one. Secondly is the buy-in. You need buy-in from the citizens, from people, from civil society, from states, from local government, from everybody. You need their buy-in, otherwise we will not be able to implement. And that buy-in is critical. And the third thing is the reform. We have some legislative imperatives. We have some legal issues that we need to amend, to work on, so that the private sector can be encouraged, and then so that we will be able to have full implementation. Lastly, as part of that legal imperative is the fact that you need both the federal government and the state government to ensure that capital budgets, for instance, part of, you amend the Fiscal Responsibility Act to make sure that capital budgets come from the National Development Plan every year. So unless your capital budget has been, your projects have been admitted in the NDP, then they don't form what you do in the budget. And once you have that mandatory as an act, then you are sure that it will be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, Sayade, I just wanted to say something about what Doctor just said. Doctor, you say the private sector will drive this plan.
Yes.
Please, can you tell us, because we have plenty private sector people here, how are we going to drive that plan?
We have, when you look at the plan, what we have had is to give the enabling environment. I know you are private sector, and that's why you are defending the private sector. We expect that private sector will be able to key into this. And I did mention something about reforms. When we were drawing up the plan, we had private sector there. And if you go sector by sector, from the financial sector, agriculture, and so on, we have some reforms that needs to be done to be able to attract capital from the private sector. We have a volume 3 of the NDP. We have the NDP, the volume 1, which most people are familiar with, has the policies, the strategies. Volume 2 consists of projects that MDAs will be running to be able to achieve it. But we had a volume 3 that had the legislative imperatives, the reforms that we need to do sector by sector. And these reforms, we just didn't see it. We had the private sector participating to say, look, we will be able to participate in a Greek only if, for instance, the land use, or we'll be able to, we want to bring our money if you do some reforms in the financial sector. And that's why we believe that the private sector will participate. Thank you.
Mr. Ighodalo, just to put you on notice, I'm going to come back to you on that, because You asked the question because clearly there's something on your mind, but I want to go to Mr. Okunbor. Mr. Okunbor.
There isn't anything special on my mind.
So you now have a few minutes to create something special. So, Mr. Okunbor, we've heard about a Nigeria that works for all. We've heard about the National Development Plan. But I want you to wear the hat of the ordinary citizen today, because in reality you're not, but for today, the ordinary citizen. What kind of success criteria would you be looking for to feel that, yes, we have shared prosperity, we have a Nigeria that works for all?
Thank you very much, moderator. Whenever I have to ponder on questions like this, it reminds me every day of the thinking that we're a country with huge potential. Heavily blessed, material resources, some of the most creative people on earth, just incredible drive. But somehow we have the worst levels of almost any indicator you can think about. Honorable Minister for State made a statement earlier in the day when we were just sharing thoughts that maybe we should step down our ambition trying to be Europe or America and just think of what makes our country work. And for me, the one that hits me very readily is just basic gainful employment of our people. That all of us in this room, I'm sure we live every day with text messages from friends, relatives, asking for the odd 10,000, 20,000. And we are forever trying to either help or fight it off. It wasn't always like this. So for me, probably the biggest connector point is how gainfully employed our people, the everyday man in the street is. We heard a lot yesterday about ease of doing business, all the state is doing about it. It starts at the level of small and medium-scale enterprises before you get to big multinationals like ourselves. The reality is that much of where the rubber hits the road in our country are at those kinds of levels. What can we be doing to ensure we remove the barriers that enables our people operate at that level and employ the odd 5, 10, 20% before we move to big manufacturing concerns and agric. So for me, employability and employment is very important, gainful employment. I think for everyday man in the street, just feeling sufficiently secure to go about their everyday lives, I think it's quite important. If you scale that up to big employers like ourselves, then it becomes more of an issue of what does it take for us to invest meaningfully in this country. And it's almost like motherhood statements these days, because we've said it over and over, repeated it conference after conference, plan after plan. We just need very basic predictability of our policies, of our laws. And as Professor Alade said earlier, policies that transcend governments. If you take an industry like the one I'm in, oil and gas, when we make investments are often tens of billions of dollars of investments. But it takes decades, most of the time, before you actually break even and realize your investments. So God save you if you plow in these kinds of numbers of investments and 2 years later, 3 years later, another group of leaders in the political leadership come in and change the basis of that investment. You've had it. And that has a way of trickling down, because when you don't invest at these kind of levels, you don't invest at SME type of level, then employability and gainful employment is a problem. Yeah. And that's where you begin to see that we struggle. So if we really can just focus at that level of our society, I think we'll see a difference. That's for me, it's quite key.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Okunbor. I'm going to also come back to you again. I'm going to Mr. Ighodalo now. We talk about stability of policies, etc., and Dr. Alade spoke about the enabling environment. I'd like you, when I come back to you, to comment on what else is required for that enabling environment for you to invest and create the employment. Well, Mr. Ighodalo, I'll rephrase the question. I don't feel I'm picking on you, but this is your swan song, so we'll ask some of these questions. Private sector. Dr. Alade has said that they expect the private sector to invest with a target amount 80-something%. What role do you see for the private sector? How do you think the private sector can partner with government to implement this national development plan?
Thank you very much. But I just want to say one quick thing about what Osagie said, and then I'll come directly to your question. Because basically why we have this platform is because we want to see how the private sector and the public sector can align and work together, agree on policies that will drive our economy in an effective and positive way. And year in, year out, we finish these sessions, we come up with recommendations, government accepts some and doesn't accept many, and we keep coming. So really, that is a major area in which we will have to improve the success rate, if I call it that. But I want to quickly go to something Osagie said. I think, and Dr. Alade said it in an indirect way, there must be predictability, there must be certainty, there must be continuity. And I want to say something that may appear a bit troublesome, but we have to think long-term positive. And long-term positive means in the political structure and arrangement we have today, it doesn't appear as if it works for continuity and planning. You know, the 4-year cycle and the 4-year political term allows for too much short-termism. So a new government comes in, it has 2 years to settle. Before it settles, it starts thinking about the next election. So it doesn't do things that are long-term in gestation. So maybe we'll have to look at the whole of our constitution and start thinking about 6 or 7 year one term for governance. So that way people can come in and can plan. And people will also be in a position to continue with the good plans of the previous government, rather than think that I have a short term, let me quickly just do what people will remember me for. So that's one way. But directly to your question, I think it's time that in conversations between the public and private sector, the public sector understands that capital, money, investment, job creation will flow to where it's wanted, where it's accepted. And somebody said it specifically yesterday, that government has a major role. We have too much regulation in our environment that doesn't support or encourage investment. In a conversation last night at one of the sessions, I was talking about, let's take SEC and FCCPA. They're both sometimes performing the same roles. So when investors want to come into this economy, or when there want to be transactions in this economy, you go to SEC for approval, you go to FCCPA for nearly the same approval. No distinction. And then we pay a fee of 800 million here, a fee of 800 million there. Now, investors that want to come into that environment will rather go to Ghana or somewhere else and then import into Nigeria. So we have to look, and we keep saying this, the NESG has been on this, other organized private sector groups have been on this. The government and the private sector must work together to encourage investment into this environment. If we don't have our own money, let's use other people's money. There's over 179 trillion of capital outside that's looking for where to invest. So why can't we have policies that encourage those investments? Why can't we just think through a Nigeria where what we're thinking about are not things that are in the selfish interest of individuals, but are in the national interest? You know, for me, and I said it earlier, it's not difficult to run this country if you have the courage, the determination, and the will. We all know what the right things are. Please, let's just get up and do them, okay?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Just to add to what Asue is saying, I want to tell you, I did mention that we have a volume 3 that talks about, that stated legislative imperatives and reforms that are needed, guidelines that needs to be changed. And I'm glad to inform you that the ministry has already taken that up. They are working with it on the legal side to see if some of these gaps can be bridged. It's not as if tomorrow, then, everything is done. But the fact that the steps have been taken, they are working with and I know that NESG also is supporting in that area. So I think what we should do is, again, continue to work with government in terms of these reforms. What do we need? What does the private sector need? What are those things that are inhibiting investment from coming in? And if we do it gradually, I'm sure we will be over the moon. The first step has been taken, working on it with the National Assembly to say we have gaps in this area and we need to do these reforms, we need to do that. And if the private sector is there, well, also the ministry is also working with the private sector, national planning, the minister is here. He has already taken that up and then they are working on it. So I believe that we're in the right direction and it will not be business as usual if the private sector can work with us. Thank you.
Mr. Okunbor, go ahead.
Yeah. It's always a very interesting paradox. So it's 86% to be driven by the private sector and maybe 14% across all the strata of states. For me, a critical enabler is the capacity of our public sector. Mm-hmm. It's so important because you can have the best of policies, you can have the best of laws. If you have a public service that is not even just the education, but the inclination, as Dr. Pascal Dozier said in his paper yesterday, to want to enable rather than see yourself as a regulator who stands in the way to dictate, then you have a problem. And people in this room come face to face with that every time. A governor once said to us in one of our extended leadership in that you are as good as a country as your public service. You can have the brightest brains in the private sector. You might be lucky to have young creative guys who can build unicorns and somehow manage to step aside from state control. But the reality is that your big mass employment elements of your economy needs to interface with the state. And if that interface produces frustration, they simply walk away. And if you play at the international level, you see that happen every time. Capital will go where it is most readily wanted. And if it comes out that there is another clime that offers not necessarily better terms, just better ease of doing business, capital just flows there. So I really want to encourage us as we think through the 2021 NDP, to think a lot more about our colleagues in the public sector who will be in the commanding heights of either regulatory actions or just interface roles to take a bit more interest in how they land on the other side. This morning we talked a lot about, in the academic sense, about those in academics going into industry. Maybe we should also increasingly consider our colleagues in the public sector spending some time in industry, in private SMEs, in proper companies, essentially to essentially see how the shoe pinches on the other side. I'm really looking for a public service that is actually primarily an enabler rather than trying to, regulation is good, but not regulation for the sake of regulation. I think where we are as a country today, what is much more important is enabling environment for businesses to thrive.
Thank you, Mr. Okunbor. So you've partially answered a follow-up question I had for you, because as we said, we don't want our public sector colleagues to think we're just here throwing stones, because after a while they'll decide that we're not coming. So how can we as the private sector support the public sector in boosting the capacity? You've said that part of it could be some of us going in, but what else can we as the private sector do?
I think that's one. I remember the gentleman on the panel talked at some point about, when discussing academics, about arrogance on both sides, which was actually quite telling to me. I think there is also that between the public and private sector, that arrogance of we are the state, this is the way we need to continue, this is the way we want to make sure we do it. On the other side, we are sitting here and saying they don't have a clue about how to do business. So I think even just the basic engagement is quite important. And seeing people, if Professor Alade talks to me, there's a way I would receive it, because I know she's been where the shoe pinched on this side, as different from one who has not been on this side. In the same way, I sometimes ask myself, I have gone through my company for well over 30 years. I have never really experienced what it means to work in the civil service. So this arrogance, it just builds up between the two. So I think so much more engagement on the basis of shared understanding of we are all headed for the same purpose, I think helps. We should jointly create, again, listened very well yesterday to the Honorable Minister for Budget and Planning talk about the third leg of the NDP being how to identify policies and laws that needed to be looked at and possibly changed. My immediate discomfort when I heard was, is it a one-sided thing? Are we part of co-creating those areas? But because I know it was private sector, again, I get a bit of comfort from that. But we really must get to a stage where one side doesn't just assume they know what the other side essentially needs, where there's a lot more conversations and inputs from folks in the private sector as to what change looks like. In my particular sector, in the petroleum sector, I think we have come a long way in that regard. So when we were doing, for example, the PIB, to become a PIA was a lot of engagement. Gas master plan, decade of gas, whatever you have to articulate in the petroleum sector, it's almost 50-50 engagement between the public and private. I think we need to extrapolate that into the wider way we essentially engage between the private sector and the public sector.
Thank you.
If I may say something about that, sorry to jump in. At the NESG, we do a lot of that. That's what our policy commissions are about. We're engaging with government at every level all the time, and we're working with government. Dr. Alade knows that we've worked with her and her team extensively on the development plans. And, one other thing, we've also always supported public sector officials
Ighodalo has said. Dr. Lawal, you're in the public sector. Tell us from your perspective how we as the private sector can improve our engagement with the public sector to ensure that there's greater understanding and greater adoption of some of the policy recommendations we make.
Thank you. When Mr. Okunbor was speaking, I was smiling. Having just retired as a permanent secretary a few months ago. So there's general mistrust, and this public service gets the feeling, rightly or wrongly, that the private sector feels they are not up to speed. So the public service feels not recognized and appreciated by the private sector most of the time. So that's the perspective out there, rightly or wrongly. And therefore, most often, the public service shies away from the engagement. Then I know that some 3-4 years down the line, a head of service, Professor Alade to be precise, brought an exchange program where the public service should take in some people from the private sector, and the private sector should also take in some people from the public service. That started, it wasn't sustained. But to be frank, I think it's something that needs to continue. Beyond that, the conversation we're having here, the private sector is saying they have been part of public service, contributing, but they're doing that in some specific portions. We need a general engagement where the entirety of the public service recognizes that the private sector is a player that must be part of governance, because it's a right for them to be part of governance and they have value to add to that governance. And also the civil or the public service recognize also that they need to also engage. So for me, it's in terms of our own basic procedure and processes, is a kind of an acceptance by government and then a circular or an information going through that going forward, this is how government will operate. In anything they do, they must consult and engage with the private sector. So I think if we have a platform like that, that is generic and every level of government is aware that you must, for example, if you are developing a certain policy, where is the input of the private sector? Have they engaged? What are their views? Are they satisfied with this? And I think when that is put as a parameter for accepting or otherwise, that will go a long way in forcing the discussion. We must have this discussion. That is the only way Nigeria can be one and we can contribute to our. So we need.
So, madam, how do we institutionalize this to ensure, like you suggested, how do we ensure that it's in place?
One of the things I would suggest is that we've been having NESG. It can be an outcome of one. And if it is followed up, it can be an official resolution and a government circular signed by the secretary to the government of the federation saying government has taken this position. After, of course, all the process unfold. And therefore, a circular is sent that henceforth to all ministers, permanent secretaries, commissioner, chairmen of agencies, this is the position of government, all going forward. All projects, programs, discussions, engagements must include the relevant private sector. So when that goes out, then that is where everybody, you can then take everybody up. Your director brings up, did you engage the private sector involved? Who are the relevant private sector in this sector? This agency, this office, and that's phone. So that's the way to embed it or to institutionalize it within the private sector. So either the head of service takes the civil service, the SGF has the public service. So when the SGF does, he now embeds both the civil and the public service. So that's my guidance going forward.
Thank you. So this panel is about implementation, right? So we're going to start now. And we're going to put our money where our mouths are. I loved what Dr. Lawal just spoke about, the exchange program between public and private sector. So I'm going to say Alpha African Advisory is going to make a public sector space available for somebody to come as part of that exchange.
Any show of hands? Other public sector volunteers? Putting their money where their mouths are. Oh, fantastic! Thank you. Because we need to make it possible, because otherwise we'll just be talking. Mrs. Johnson.
I mean, there's not much to add, but I think the idea, there's enough use cases, so to speak, right, in terms of this engagement, right? So it really shouldn't be that hard to institutionalize, right? There's been very major policies in different industries that has required that engagement with the public and private sector, right? And so in terms of implementing, so for example, if we look at the panel earlier this morning, right, where we talked about education, and one of the panelists talked about there was no framework for having a visiting professor, right? And that is a clear low-hanging fruit in terms of improving capacity, right? I want to be able to introduce a new course, I don't have the capacity to do that, but there's somebody from the private sector, right? So things like that, you start to get practical around, how you can have that engagement and institutionalizing it. I think the other thing too is that, and again, it came out from one of the panels yesterday, right? We can't downplay, the public sector is such a big lever, right? So for example, I think yesterday in one of the panels, and it even came out, in one of the panels earlier today, was around the compensation packages, for the civil service, right? And for me, it was insightful. I just never knew how big that disparity was, right? And again, look, we're human beings and we work with incentives, right? And if you have somebody, being very poorly paid, right? Even just the way the person thinks about themselves, right? Has an impact when you then bring some work to them, right? So you can't downplay, the importance of even some of the public sector. Like, how do you kind of, rectify this where there's such a huge gap in terms of kind of compensation, right? Because these are the same people that you want to be able to work with, right? Doctor talked about trust, right? These are some of the things that, exacerbate this trust deficit, right? Because the person on the other hand is saying that, look, I'm being paid such a pittance, that's a reflection of what you think about me, right? So again, it's to say that one, there's been a lot of use cases successfully that, having to institutionalize this thing about, the public and the private sector shouldn't be that hard, but also not to underestimate the big lever on the public sector side.
Thank you. I want to take this thing down another level because again, I'm just going to keep harping on implementation. And I think it was probably about 2018, I came for NESG, and it struck me that one of the challenges that we have with implementation is we don't join the dots. The different departments are working in silos, and it's clear that often they don't even understand the impact of action taken in Department A on Department B's plans. So, Dr. Lawal, how and what can be done to ensure that there's a greater harmonization and coordination of implementation?
Thank you. Well, I think I'll speak to what currently is happening now in governance. And that's specifically at the end of the third year ministerial retreat that held on last month, where first I want to assume that each of us know that the current administration has chosen 9 priority areas where they're giving attention to, which the administration believes that if they're able to significantly add value in those areas, it will reduce the challenges the country is facing. So within those 9 priority areas, Mr. President, at the end of the retreat, signed the executive order number 012, that's number 12, essential. And that executive order essentially is to improve performance management, coordination, and implementation of the presidential priority areas. That specific executive order also established what is known as the Central Delivery Coordinating Unit inside the office of the Secretary to the Government of the Federation. And what that Central Coordinating Unit does is to be able to track and monitor all the targets that are required to achieve the priority areas, covering 29 ministries and the Office of the Head of Civil Service of the Federation. And that tracking is done in partnership with the Federal Minister of Finance, Budget, and National Planning. Then also to add that, back to 2019, the president signed performance bond with all the ministers, with what each minister is delivering within that 9 priority areas. So that has been done, and that is what is being tracked annually at the retreat. A report is being given where there are green lights is discussed, where it's still gray or red, it is discussed and flagged, and challenges are escalated. So in terms of specific implementation, this Executive Order 12 has broken the implementation framework or delivery framework into 4 levels. The first level is what is referred to, which is the highest level, is the cabinet ministers level, where the Secretary of the Government of the Federation will lead all the ministers and the head of service to look at where they are on the 9 priority areas together, collectively. And I will want to add that none of the 9 priority areas has one MDA responsibility. It's different MDAs who bring in their bits that will contribute to the whole picture. So that is the first level, where it will now be chaired by the Secretary of the Government of the Federation with the other ministers. Then the second level is that of the technical level, where the permanent secretary in charge of the cabinet affairs office, the permanent secretary covering the Federal Executive Council, will now chair a meeting with the coordinator of the delivery unit, technical partners, and the other level of managers that are supporting the delivery unit. Then the third level, the third lower level, is that of the delivery coordinator at the office of the SGF, with the other ministries' delivery managers, where they will also look at the same thing and then it will escalate at that level. And the third level and last level is the intra, that's within the same ministry. The Department of Planning, Research and Statistics has the mandate to coordinate the delivery and the output that will move from there. Essentially is to improve, institutionalize probity, accountability, and transparency, and also bring coherence in governance so that people are not working desperately. So that has been signed. And one of the major expectations is that we add the strength for the next administration not to be able to drop everything, to be able to pick it on board, and then they can review and add on to that so that it can ensure sustainability and growth for the government. So in terms of implementation, I think that's what is on the ground at the moment. And the CDU, for us at 2 days, they have finished training 19 ministries on their own. The technical team is the Foreign and Development Commonwealth Office. They're the ones supporting the process.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Sonade, I want to ask Doctor, how well is this thing working? How efficiently, how well is it working?
Well, let me say, the CD is just beginning. So we can report to how well it's working after some few months. I said it was signed last year. So, but the delivery unit has been established. Yes. And as the delivery was established about 6 months ago. And I know that on monthly basis, summary of performance is being shared with the president. But the executive order that was signed last month with the different levels of tracking has not taken off yet. These are the implementation plans in process that are being worked on. So, but I think going forward, we can ask how far and what progress are being made so that other stakeholders can add value and improve on the process as we move.
If I could just, I think it's such an excellent process in performance management. My concern, I think Doctor tried to refer to it, is how do we transit this to the next level? Because we don't want to be sitting here in NESG, at NESG 29, and we have another structure being articulated by the government. So what are the inherent institutions of the state that ensures what you have just described will move from one administration to the other seamlessly? Or is it likely to just be another one in 6 to 9 months? We have forgotten about it. That's my immediate concern, actually.
I want to say that it is not meant to be a single one. In fact, why it is established as an executive order is to be able to give it the backing for it to transit to the next administration. And then, of course, we may not expect the next administration to take everything, but at least it's something for them to review and work upon. In addition, the same office that has this has the mandate of delivering the transition and the documentation for the transition to the next administration. Yeah, but I won't be able to guarantee that. But yes, the thinking, the planning, and the steps that have been taken, that has been taken on board to ensure that there is continuity to some level of what's happening on the ground at the moment. Yeah.
So what we all have to hope for is the assiduous and sustained, yes, effective, yes, implementation.
Sorry if I may just add that when the CDC, the Central Delivery Unit was created, I know that last in August, they were launching a situation where Nigerians can engage with the delivery unit. You can track, you can follow a specific project, look at its location and send a report or otherwise to the delivery unit to say, this is what is happening in my community. There's such project from, for example, Federal Ministry of Agriculture. It is there on the dashboard, but it is not reaching the level it is, and then there will be feedback. So that, I think, is also part of government's efforts to ensure that the citizens participate in that. But how far it will go, maybe in the next 3 to 6 months or less, in the next 3 months, we'll be able to specifically report on that, and then maybe bring the person that is on that desk to be able to respond to the greater details of what is happening in that office.
Thank you.
Can
So,
I-
yes, I'm going to come to you.
I just want to ask Dr. Lawal, why can't we have some of these things as law? Sorry. Because if it's the law, when we're talking about reforms and some of these legislative imperatives, then you are sure it remains rather, and then it becomes mandatory for the incoming government as well.
I don't think there's anything stopping the effort to make it a law, but when we're looking at it, this is November, and we are looking at where we are for elections. I'm not sure anybody will be very glad to listen to you that you want to make a law that will ensure transition. I think it's something that could have been done much earlier. But I think part of the lessons of the last 3 years is what brought the understanding and the realization that government must work as a whole of government, not as individual ministries of government. For me, if that has been accepted and recognized, that is one level of progress. Then going forward, we can make more progress. But there's nothing wrong in legalizing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alade, I'm going to come to you because thank you very much, Dr. Lawal. But what you've spoken about is more on the sort of federal, the national level. But often when we talk about government, we speak as if it's one monolithic body, but it isn't. We've got subnationals. So to Dr. Alade, how can we ensure that we're also having alignments to this NDP by the subnationals as well?
Thank you, Senator. What we had in when we were preparing the plan, and we had the parameters after the macro model, the assumptions, the targets that we have. We shared it with the state governments. And this is the way. You have a joint planning board consisting of all commissioners of planning at state level, and then for the federal as well. So there were meetings with them to say that this is what the government is looking at. And then you have the National Council on Development headed by the minister. The Joint Planning Board, I think, is headed by the PAMSEC. So there were, interactions to say this is what we want. And you then have at the top is the National Economic Council headed by the VP. And you have all the governors. It was also shared with them. We also had meetings. And, after the MDAs, that's from the federal side, to say this is what we have for the nation. So we expected that after those meetings, that the state governments, those who haven't done their medium-term plan, will align. And by alignment, we mean, complementarity, so that we are not going different directions. So we expected that they will go back and then align with what we have. And we also did that again after the National Development Plan was, about to be concluded, not finalized. We also shared with them, this is where we are, this is the targets that we have, and so on. So we expect that given those kind of parameters, targets, assumptions that we have, that state governments will have gone back to be able to do their own and key into it. And I'll give you one example, which is transportation, for instance. If the federal government was going to spend X amount on transportation and we're coming to the states to say that this federal government roads will be done, you would have expected that the state government will then look at their own budgets and say, okay, if you have this federal government's road being done, the state government can also do this. And then rural roads can link to it so that we can then reduce post-harvest losses and food can move. So that's the kind of thing, the complementarity which we expected will be done. I spoke a few minutes ago about the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that if it's amended, you should then have capital budgets coming in from the NDP. Some states also have that. They have the responsibility, they have adopted the responsibility, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is domiciled in their state. We also expected that for each budget, they also should be able to make it mandatory that capital budgets must come from the medium-term development plan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, maybe that was the technical guys' ways of telling us we barely have 10 minutes.
I'm sure you were scared.
So the next few questions, I'm afraid the next few questions have to be rapid fire because we have barely 10 minutes and we need to be able to have a round for close. Mr. Okunbor, I'm coming to you. You've heard all these things, implementation, etc. But from your experience, what are some of the pitfalls to implementation that we need to avoid and how do we avoid them? Bearing in mind you have to respond in 2 minutes.
We've covered much of it, actually. Like we said at the beginning, what we are not short of as a country, as a people, is well-articulated plans. Is really the will to implement. And a key part of this, from where I sit, is just this lack of continuity from government to government. It's a key part of it, where people feel like very well articulated just now. Everyone buys into it, this is the way to go. And by the time you have a new government, it's essentially a different conversation. We are a country. We are not necessarily a country of government to government. We are a country of policies, laws, and processes that should move across boundaries of governments. Mm-hmm. So I think that continuity in policies and processes is key. I think we have discussed earlier the whole business of between the operators or the implementers or the users of these policies and those who are mandated to superintend the compliance of it. There needs to be a bit more conversation as to how best to do it. So when it is not working, because there are sometimes obvious laws and policies that simply are not just workable in the real business world, how to engage to find another course of action is just as crucial as the policy itself, rather than people stand in front of you and say, this is a rule, this is a policy, thou must go this way. So that element of flexibility that comes out of engagement, I think, will be a key factor. So the two I would actually highlight is that consistency from one government to another, and a flexibility that comes from engagement between the implementers of the policy, or the regulators, as we call them, and those who are users of this policy.
Okay, thank you. Just leading up from that, Mr. Ighodalo, if you were here yesterday and they were talking about the Nigeria we want and various panelists being asked, what would you do differently? There was a recurring theme: remove fuel subsidy and remove foreign exchange subsidy. But again, that's the what, right? What's the how? How, and obviously, I know it's a tough question, but how do you think one could go about implementing stuff like that, bearing in mind the comments Mr. Okunbor just shared?
The big elephants in the room, right?
Yes, we had to come to it.
The fuel subsidy, how? I see the chief of staff is here. The fuel subsidy, how is that the chief of staff and the president sit down and say no more fuel subsidy, and they pass it down to the NNPC. The NNPC buys fuel at market price. That's how. There's no ceremony to this. The issue can then be, do we want to do it in a phased way or one time? Now, we have to look at all kind of economic indices and all that. But again, the people that are benefiting from this subsidy, they're not the people that should be benefiting from subsidy. The people that we think we want to benefit from subsidy already pay market for kerosene, pay market for diesel, and they enter diesel buses. So who are those people that are benefiting from PMS? Who? So the chief of staff is here. So between him and Mr. President tomorrow, let them say no fuel subsidy, and then there will be no fuel subsidy. NNPC will allow everybody to import at markets. End of the matter. It's not difficult. It's the will, and then they should determine if they want to have the will. As for the other elephant, I think that requires even deeper, deliberate thinking. Like I said earlier, we have the supply side, we have the revenue side. But I think what's the more important issue is the transparency of allocation. If you don't have enough of something for now, you're going to try and get more of it, or find a way to ask people not to ask for more of it. But the little you have, how do you then disaggregate it? Do I trust the process? Are we auctioning fairly? Or are we saying only this sector, because that's the sector government wants to support for now, but it must be transparent. We can't just ask, how did this money flow, and we don't know. So I think people are more concerned today about the transparency of the system. We need to look at that. But I just want to add a couple of things. A couple of things. PDG spoke yesterday about a lot of the work that the NESG had done over the years. And one of them was the Nigerian Investment Promotion Act, 1997 or something at the time. The essence of that law was that we would have a one-stop center for every investment application into this country. That was the reason for that law. Now, it's not so. So, Honorable Minister, sir, in considering those binding constraints, can we please go back to it so that we're not going to Ministry of Internal Affairs for business permits, SEPAC, go to another ministry for something else. Let's go to one place. Now, if our investors know that if they go to NIPC, they get everything they want, it makes life simpler for everybody. Also, sir, I want to say something, and we've got you here, we've got the Chief of Staff here, and we have the Office of the Secretary of Government here. Those of us who practice in the capital markets, and there were there was talk about capital market investments into Nigeria. Those who practice in the private sector transactions that create jobs and build the economy were strangulated, we're being strangulated. We go to SEC for approval, and there are overlaps. We find ourselves having to go to FCC, PC for the same approvals. Then we pay 800 million naira as fees to one, we pay 700 million. So before we start the transaction, we've spent more money paying regulatory fees than the cost of the transaction itself. So, honorable ministers, let's look at these areas. They're low-hanging fruits, and they can help drive a lot of creativity, job creation, a lot of investment flows, regardless of our other problems. Then we can look at the bigger issues, security and all the other bigger issues. When we take these lesser issues, low-hanging fruits, short-term issues, it'll help, and it will help a great deal. That's my feeling. And I think the will to even do those small things haven't come up. So if the will to do small things are not there, how do you get the will to do big things?
So thank you, Mr. Ighodalo. Honorable Minister, I'm putting you on a little bit of notice that you've had direct comments, etc., that would like a little bit of feedback. But just before you do, sir, so you can have the final word before the closing, I'm going to Mrs. Johnson. You've heard over the course of the last hour about all the different things that the next government will have to do. The elections are coming up. We're looking at different potential leaders. What would you say we should be looking for when choosing the leadership for the next term?
So it's a very good question. And I think in all contexts and different industries, the concept of leadership, the concept of successful leadership always includes a visionary leader. And I think that's more so important for us, as a nation. It has to be a visionary leader. I mean, it's come up in different discussions yesterday and today. But when you stop to think about it, that person that is Jack buying, right? And I think that has even been romanticized, right? I think more of the person that has made the dangerous trek, up to North Africa into Syria, and then is swimming into kind of France and Italy, right? That person has lost hope, right? That person is tired and has lost hope. And when you have someone where there is just no ounce of hope left, right? It's a dangerous place to be in. And so when I think about it, right, that visionary leadership is important, right? And it's even more important, right? Because you are now leading a set of people where that hope deficit, is even greater, right? So that's one thing. I think the second thing is then decisive leadership, right? And there are different terms to it. And a lot of it we've talked about, right? I mean, in a prior life, I used to be in strategy. And my role was to, come up with these different ideas or policies, as we would call them, right? Brilliant ideas. But then my work stopped there because I had to pass them on to somebody to execute. And that's where the breakdown happened. And I used to see competitors, right, who were brilliantly executing mediocre ideas and had, even greater performance. And we've talked about it. It's the execution, right? And that decisive leadership is also important. So when I think about it, I think those are the two things that we're looking for in our next leadership.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, but Yvonne, we already know our candidates. So you're talking theoretically. We already know our candidates. So why are you talking theoretically?
I can't hear. I think of my it's not working.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the floor. We only have a very, very short period of time now, but the Honorable Minister, if we can invite you for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to take Q&A, one online that will come to my phone and one from the floor. But everything, we are incredibly short of time, so we've got to be really brief now. Thank you.
Honorable Minister, I was just making suggestions. I was just making suggestions.
Is there?
Yeah, thank you very much for allowing me this space. Most of the questions that were being asked and also being answered here are already in the National Development Plan. The questions are there. The answers have been provided. And one of the things I will encourage all of us to do is to try and go through that document. If you just Google, you will see the document there so you can download it. Because when the MD of Shell was speaking about engagement, it was as if it's a document that was written by the federal government of Nigeria. We realized that the plans that we have had in the past had failed for certain reasons. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand why those plans failed. One of the things that came out clearly was that the past plans were not inclusive, they were not participatory. In fact, most of them were written by consultants. These consultants were not Nigerians, so they don't wear our shoes and they don't know where it pinches. And it took a process of bringing together the various diversities that we have in the country. Mr. President approved the inclusion of the chairman of PDP, chairman of ABGA, and chairman of APC in the development of the plan. That is to say that he really wanted to have a national development plan. The whole idea is that in the past, the plans that we've had have been seen to be federal government of Nigeria plan. And just to run away from that fact, we needed the subnationals to be involved. The governors, that's the 36 states, and the 774 local governments that we have in the country. Because really, where does the rubber hit the road? It's in the states and in the local government. When you say federal, does federal have land? So the agri policies that are put there that has to do with land, who should be the one implementing them? It should be at the state level. The private sector, like I said yesterday, contributes 92% of GDP. And so we said private sector should lead in the development of this plan. I am glad that the NESG chair was a formidable member of the development plan process. Aside from him as a person, we had the NESG involved. We had 26 technical working groups. Each of the states produced 2 participants in those technical working groups. We couldn't bring in 2 from 774 local governments. Otherwise, you have a war. So what we did was to ask Algon to give us 52 members, 2 each, to be in those 26 technical working groups. In the working group that had to do with the oil and gas sector where you come from, it was heavily dominated by a lot of retirees from the oil sector, Shell, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. We didn't really want to bring in serving members from this oil and gas industry because there could be issues around conflict of interest. So we thought we shouldn't do that. And then when we talk about government, I think that we also need to disaggregate what is government. Because I know that when it rains in my village, it's the federal government that is blamed. Or when there's no teacher in the primary school in my village, we say government didn't provide, but we should be ready to specify exactly who that government is. I started as being an economist before I got confused and then went into the supply management space. But I know that human wants are numerous. These human wants are insatiable. They are insatiable because of the resources are scarce. So the issue of allocation of resources is always very, very key. But when we come to the issue of democracy, it has to do with the delivery of the greatest good to the greatest number of people. And so where do the greatest number of our people live in? It's in the rural areas. Are we delivering to them in the rural areas? The answer is no, we are not. Who should do this delivery? Is it the federal, the state, or the local governments? You know the answer to that question. There was an issue around employment. Okay. Who employs more in the country? Is the MSMEs. They employ about 70% of our people. The organized private sector handles the other 30%. But most of the policies that we pursue, who are they for? It's for the organized private sector, the 30%. Again, looking at the democracy, delivering the greatest good to the greatest number of people. Again, the MSMEs are left out. And that is why one of the things that we have said in the National Development Plan, one, we talked about integrated rural development. I think I spoke around this last night at the Impact Investment Forum. Currently, our food comes from the rural areas. 60% of our people live in these rural areas. 60% of what is produced does not get to the market. So for every 10,000 tons of food that is produced, only 4,000 gets to the market because there's no access to the market. There are no roads. There is no power in the rural areas. All our governors concentrate on usually are the state capitals. And then we hear celebration of 12 flyover bridges or 30 flyover bridges, which covers only maybe 1/3 of a state.
Understood.
And governors are in competition in building flyovers, but they are not building roads to the rural areas where the farms are.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Minister.
Currently, yesterday we talked about inflation. And it was said that the reason for the high inflation of food items has to do with transportation, the supply chain. But at the farm gate, the prices are low. So the farmers who put in all this sacrifice get little or nothing for it. And that is why the National Development Plan talks about building rural roads around the agro corridors, providing power. And because we know that there is this issue around transmission, the plan talks about off-grid power, renewable energy, which can easily be put in this area. And the Communications and Digital Economy Ministry has been charged to ensure that they take broadband technology, fiber optics to the rural areas. It goes a long way in solving so many problems, including our population explosion. In the rural areas, at 6 p.m., everybody goes to bed. What usually is the result of that? 9 months after, quadruplets, triplets, all over the place.
Thank you.
But if we are able to create opportunities in these areas, take power there, have access to road, even if they don't have cinema houses, they will be able to, with the fiber optics, watch Netflix. They get tired and then they go to sleep.
Population control at work, implementing a population control strategy.
But this is the issue. The opportunities are in the urban areas because that's where we all spend our money. 60% of the current demography are youths, and we have already said 60% of our people live in the rural areas. So they move from the rural areas to the urban areas. They cannot afford to stay in Via and Ikoyi like the elites that are here. So what they do, they go to Kokomaiko and those other places. What do they do there? No work. So Paraga, they start to take drugs. At night when you are sleeping, they come and ensure you don't sleep. But if we provide opportunities for them in the rural areas, this won't happen. And that is why I said, Abraham Maslow talked about the hierarchy of needs. I believe that we are still at the bottom of that hierarchy of needs. We cannot be talking about self-actualization when we have not been able to provide the basic necessities, food, shelter, and housing for our people. And 60% of our people need this. That should be a priority. We can plan on going to the moon in the next decade. That is fine. But first, let's take care of the basics.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Honorable Minister, Mr. Awoboku was here yesterday, one of the panelists.
Yeah.
And he said, sometimes those who should do it are the ones talking about it.
Yeah.
So, sir, you are in a position to do it.
Yeah.
Talk to the governors, implement policies. So don't talk to us about it. Tell us how you will do it.
That is, no, I'm telling you. No. Thank you. The first, a problem that is known is already half solved. And that is why the plan was put in place. The second one is, why has there been difficulties in implementation in the past? Those binding constraints were identified. And they were identified by the organized private sector. They identified 18 laws and 10 policies. I have set up the committee to work on this, and they are working with Olaniwa Ajayi and company. I'm sure you know that firm. They just celebrated 60 years of existence. They are working on the plan continuity bill, and they are also working on those other binding constraints. Of course, it's going to take time. It's not, even if you want to have children and you decide to marry today and you meet your wife today, there's necessarily a gestation period, minimum of 9 months that you have to go through for it to happen. So all those are taking place. In terms of implementation mechanism, the plan sets us 2 frameworks.
Mr. Minister, just so you know, right now I'm in big trouble with the organizers.
It's important because the plan sets us 2 frameworks. There's a national steering committee for implementation because this is a national plan and not a state federal government plan. And that is headed by the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Through using like the NEC mechanism, he has the authority to be able to get the governors together and also the MDAs. And that is the Secretariat is in the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning.
Thank you, sir.
Then there is also a plan implementation unit that deals with the technical issues regarding implementation. So we just allow them to do their work and go through the usual gestation. And I believe that those results will begin to flow. Okay.
So we have, unfortunately, thank you, Mr. Minister. Okay. Thank you. We unfortunately have time for just one question. So fastest, Mr. Yes, sir. Just there. And the response, only one response, super fast, and then we close with 1 minute.
My name is, I'm Professor Tunde Olaopa, a retired federal permanent secretary. I teach in NIPS, Kuru. Now, just an input to what my colleague, Dr. Abiba Lawa, on what the public administration literature call institutionalizing a public-private sector incorporated operation model. How is that done in other clients? It's a role of the state relative to market conversation. The truth of the matter is that the state scope of function is too large. That is holding it from performing. So we need to streamline that so that the state can concentrate on what it can do best. And lastly, there are so many models of co-product operation with the industry that are outsourcing and all. The second thing quickly is there is what we call the senior executive service model. The public service can give 30% of the top leader managerial position to other sectors of the economy.
Thank you.
That come under renewable contract. That will be reinforced by corporate governance practices in the public sector and state reinforcing the state staff exchange program, doing joint training and all of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Since that was a comment, room for just one question if there is, otherwise we'll move to closing. Dr. Lawal. 1 minute, please, for each person. Just your parting thoughts. The parting thoughts could be what you yourself are taking from this panel or the last day and a half and what you're going to do differently. In fact, each person's closing statement must have an action commitment.
Personally, I haven't been part of all the last 2 days, but I'm taking away with me the necessary need to ensure anything that needs to be done is done to ensure that the transition from one government to another takes as much as possible the current happenings or the current priorities of this administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Alade.
Thank you. I want to close with the elephant in the room, one of the elephants. There were two. And that elephant is on subsidy. I believe, and the question then was how, which Asue was trying to answer. I think one of the things that government hasn't done enough is communications. It doesn't matter if you are removing it in 1 month, in 6 months, in 4 months. The communication out there for the ordinary Nigerian, for the taxi driver, for the other, is that we are going to be paying more for fuel, and then food will be expensive, this will be. I think we have to go back and tell the people what it is. We must prepare them and tell them what we are spending on subsidy, why it is necessary to remove it, and if government removes it, what are we doing with the money? That conversation is necessary, and government must begin today. Otherwise, what you have out there is different, and that's why you have people coming up in arms to say, don't remove subsidy. And I wish we will then change that narrative.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just very quickly, all I want to say is that we need to sustain the public-private dialogue in respect, without arrogance, and in building more trust. I think where we work better, public and private sector, we will do better for our country. We shouldn't suspect each other. We should always believe that we all want to work for the betterment of Nigeria. I think that's key. Having done the summit for nearly 30 years, we still haven't achieved the level of trust that we should have. And I think that's going forward, that's what we should do. If the level of trust is tighter, it's easier for government to be more receptive of the recommendations that come. If government is more receptive of those recommendations, they're implemented quicker, faster, and more efficiently. And if they are implemented that way, we'll have a much better country. If you look at the recommendations from the first summit in 1993 till today, if we had implemented half, it would be a better and a greater country. So those will be my parting words. I think we should be tighter at this summit and at other engagements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I leave the summit with, frankly, renewed hope for our country. I have been incredibly impressed from just listening to the articulation of the National Development Plan, and more importantly, the hows of how we're going to implement it. I think leaving, I need to do my own bit as well to find out a bit more and frankly, poke a bit more to say, why not this, why not that? I think it's our pathway to getting to where we want to get to. I'll join Asue in essentially saying it's extremely important that we build a culture of continuity from government to government. It's there's no gainsaying the fact that half of us in this room have that concern that all these beautiful structures and frameworks we are building, where we meet again next year, are they going to be sustained? So just doing everything we can as a people, public sector, private sector, in collaboration to ensure that we carry forward forcefully and that execution of much of these plans is our watchword.
So just quickly for me, I think my big insight and takeaway from the conference is I'm actually leaving with, just being very impressed and inspired by the public sector, actually. just a lot of what I've heard in the panels, some of the people that have spoken, some of the ideas that I know are going out there. And I think the question now becomes, how do we make sure that that decisive leadership, that will to execute is also increased? But I'm very inspired by what I've heard from the public sector in the last 2 days.
Thank you. So in closing, I think we're leaving here quite clear that the way forward is greater and better quality engagement between the public sector and the private sector. So from that, I say to our new incoming chair, welcome. Your work is cut out for you because you now have to answer the question and work with all the different stakeholders to see how that can be achieved. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Where are the photographers, please, very quickly, 30 seconds. Thank you. While there, Honorable Minister, please. Okay, the ministers and the chief of staff, please. While we're having the photograph, let me just also announce here very quickly before people leave that tomorrow we'll be having the Gender and Inclusion Summit right here in this hall, themed Connecting the Dots for Gender Inclusive Society. The British High Commissioner to Nigeria and the US Ambassador to Nigeria will be addressing the summit. Please, here from 9 a.m. in the morning. And the summit will be hosted by the NESG Policy Innovation Center. Thank you very much.